Good morning, and thank you for joining us here on the OLab and Friends channel. Uh, I am Avonelle Wing. I am here talking with Tanya Pobuda, and we're going to be discussing gender and racial representation in board games. Tanya, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a PhD candidate at York and X University in Toronto. And I'm actually working on what is essentially a 3-year project on gender and racial representation in the board gaming hobby and industry. So labor practices as well as the cultural practice of board gaming. And I've been working on this for about 3 years. And it all kind of started with a study I did back in 2018, where I mapped the top 200 board game geek games and found out, who designed these games, what's their demography, the demography of the labor pool, and then again looked at from that data, what does the artwork on board game covers look like? And from that really small scale study, I realized there was an incredible appetite for academic peer reviewed research on board gaming. There's a bit of a dearth of it right now, so I decided to make that my PhD topic, and I basically doubled the size of my database, and did an analysis of both board game arts as well as designers, and then, of course, heard from the community in an online survey about what they felt about representation. And, I'm actually coming to doctoral studies, my PhD, after a long career in communications, marketing, research and development, and helping startups, incubators mostly, with things like audience analysis and market research. So it was kind of a natural fit.
Um, I know a fair amount about your work just because I've been following your progress, and we've talked about what you're doing and the importance of it. Uh, what overall, if you were to sum up your work in or your findings in a half dozen sentences, what is the core of what you've discovered?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to show you a really quick slide, just a top line perspective, and I'm actually just going to scroll through and find, the big top line finding is the labor pool for board game design, based on the data set, which is the Board Game Geek Top 400, is skewed overwhelmingly toward white men. So you're looking at the labor pool, because again, I was trying to sort of create some building blocks to answer a core question in the research, which is, are there factors that delimit or limit the growth of board gaming? And one of the things, starting with the labor pool as the first building block, what I discovered is that, the labor of board game design is overwhelmingly skewed toward white men. And to the point where it is, over 90% of that labor pool, a very diminishingly small group of women are involved, 12 exactly, based on my research, as well as a very, very small segmentation of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, person of color men who are part of that labor pool. So very, very tiny. And overwhelmingly, again, that labor pool is very skewed toward white males. At 92.6%. And so that's the first building block. I wanted to find the answer to that question. And it was a very laborious, exhaustive, methodologically exhaustive process to come to that conclusion, because a lot of folks have asked me questions about the method that I used. I had to hire additional coders. We had to verify each other's work, make sure that there was, the technical term is no coding drift, where we're saying, okay, is this person? How do they present? How do they self-identify? Do a lot of research into each and every designer to, look at interviews, their social media profiles, and find out everything we possibly could about each designer. And there were in excess of 500 designers. So the process was months and months long. And this was a data pool that I did in June of 2020 from Board Game Geek. And so, here's some of the by the number. There were actually 11 white women, one white non-binary person, 540 white men, and 6 BIPOC men represented in that labor pool. And people often ask, top line headlines from the research, did this get better or worse based on your 2018 study? And the answer is it didn't really move. So for the top 200, it was 93.5% white male in that labor pool. So the first question in that building block was, was the demography of board game design diverse? And the answer, of course, there is no. And what I thought was really interesting is there's a lot of parallels to other research like this, which I drew my inspiration from. One was this terrific report on diversity, the Comprehensive Annenberg report on diversity that looked at film and television and found
Mhm.
that, pulling from this as an inspiration, 71.7% of all speaking roles on movies, televisions, and television series and web series are white. And so they did a very, very rigorous quantitative analysis. And what I think is really interesting here is that this is, again, there's parallels in lots and lots of different industries. This is an analysis that was done of readings assigned in political science departments, and 3.5% are BIPOC, 15.45% are women. So board gaming is not alone in its, this labor pool skew. Another really shocking stat just to underpin, that this is across the board. I do a lot of work in Wikipedia, and only 17% of all Wikipedia bios are of women, which I thought was really shocking.
Well, some of
And
that is because it's real. I've worked with women in indie RPGs to try to
yes,
get Wikipedia entries approved, and
yes,
the number of women I know who have worked in indie RPGs for ages
yeah,
who don't have Wikipedia pages yet because they just threw up their hands and said, "Okay, screw it. If it's going to be this complicated, I'm not going to bother." And
100%.
so it's not that we don't exist; it's that the process is stacked against us.
100%. And only 10% of Wikipedia editors, of which I am one, only 10% are women or identify as a woman. And so it is a gauntlet that you have to run through with Wikipedia. And absolutely right. I've actually done what I believe to be sort of justice oriented Wikipedia jams to help bolster the board game content and other topics on Wikipedia. And the pushback is real, right? You do get pushed back saying, this article's not notable, this person isn't sufficiently accomplished. And we've had situations where, we're working on one profile, it was a botanist who had won multiple science awards, and we still got pushback on it. So it is a systemic issue across the board. And again, that top line finding, I also looked at board game art. So the next building block was, okay, what does the board game art look like? And the question was answered by, a very, very significant skew toward men and boys. I looked at human representation as well as fauna, anything that was animate. I counted, and it was almost 2,000 figures across 200 board games. And 76.8% of that sample were male presenting. And, a scant 23.2% were women or girls in presentation. And I thought that was really interesting. And then I looked at the racial dimension and found that that was even a more significant skew um, toward white presentation. And so, in excess of 80% of the figures counted when gender and race could be identified, in this case, race, were basically white. And then again, a very low percentage of the representation was BIPOC. And so, the answer to the question is, does a diverse team create a little bit more diverse output? And you can see here that again, it's quite heavily skewed. So you've got a situation where of the human presenting figures on the artwork, we've got 528 white presenting figures and 112 BIPOC. And what's out of scope for my research, but is something that came up a lot in the qualitative findings, is a lot of this content was seen to be offensive in nature. So when you have a BIPOC presenting figure of that 112, some of them are not positive representations at all. And so you've got this really interesting skew and mix. So these are some of the headlines from the research, and you can see that overweighting of white and male. But what's troubling, I think, as well, from a sort of deeper perspective, is you're more likely to see something that doesn't exist. So an alien, an orc, an imp, a dragon, then you would see a woman on a piece of cover art. And again, a
Wow.
very significant overorientation of white presenting males. And the other thing is, I actually did some compare and contrast here to say, okay, you're more likely to see a bird on a cover than you would a BIPOC woman. Specifically, BIPOC women, I think, is the most troubling of my findings. Of the nearly 2,000 figures that I counted, only 35 of them were BIPOC, Black Indigenous, person of color, women. And I found that really, really sad. And, similarly, you're more likely to see a horse than a BIPOC woman on a cover. And so it's really, really upsetting. And I think that that's something that is widely known in the industry, that that is a huge gap. And there's a couple of stories that kind of flow from my research that are a little more heartening, but these were very troubling findings. So, and again, that second research question was really like, no, these first two building blocks, there's no diversity, there's a lack of representation that does appear from the qualitative findings is perceived to be very poor representation or very negative representation. And so one of the things that I'm doing this research for is to kind of do a reality check for game companies, for publishers, to say, you're really missing the boat. And I did a breakdown, an urban breakdown, because one of the interesting findings from my research is the people who play board games tend to be very educated. They tend to have a fairly, sort of median, above median household income. They tend to live in urban centers. And I did a kind of breakdown of, this is what, in this case, Chicago looks like. This is, the racial breakdown of Chicago. So it's almost a 50-50 split.
Right.
Similarly in New York City, you've got 57.27% BIPOC in New York City. So when I'm sort of communicating this out to game publishers, I'm saying, you really need to look at, especially if you're trying to crack the US or Canadian markets, you really need to think about, what your representation on your product, which is essentially marketing, is doing to audiences, especially
Yep.
in these huge consumer hubs. And so those first two building blocks kind of bring me to, okay, now I asked, board gamers, and this was done in late 2020. How does a lack of representation make you feel? Does this have an impact on you from a purchasing perspective, a play perspective? How does it make you feel in the communities where you practice board gaming? And those were some really interesting findings there. But one of the other really big kind of top line headlines from this research is, taking a page from some of the work that's being done in film and television. And this is kind of my warning to publishers and game companies and people who organize gaming events, et cetera, is, a lesson from Hollywood. A very recent study that was done in 2020 found that, this is Higginbotham, Phil Zeng, and Ulis that conducted this study, that if you say you create a movie and it's $159 million to produce, you will lose $32.2 million at the box office on opening weekend if your film lacks authentic representation. And that means, non-stereotypes, positive representations, diversity in your film. If you don't have it, you're going to lose over the course of that film's run 80% of your budget. And I think there's a real lesson
Wow.
here for board gaming. It's a quite a shocking finding, but I think quite quite accurate. And so, you have to ask, when you look at cultural industries like board gaming, like gaming in general, like film, why are publishers, why are creators making these decisions? And so, that's, and for me, as a person who used to work in industry, helping companies do audience mapping, do research about their markets, it's not for a financial reason that they're making these kinds of decisions to skew so heavily toward a demography in the US at any rate that is a roughly 34 to 33% of the population. And if you look at white straight males in the US population, that's about 24% of the total population of the US. So it's a small sliver of demography. And if you're constantly sort of working to that very super saturated base in board gaming, that may be that's definitely a miss from a market bottom line fiscal perspective. So, then I pivoted to an online survey where I looked at a bunch of different fora across the internet, the Reddit board games forum, as well as a bunch of different fora on Board Game Geek. And I sort of solicited feedback recruiting for diversity. And I got 320 participants in that research. And for me, I really wanted to find out, okay, yeah, I got these findings. Does it matter? Does this bug board gamers? Is this something that delimits, their interest in playing or accessing spaces? And what I found was pretty surprising. And the other really interesting thing about this is, I got 174 voluminous written comments. I think, people going through my survey just shared these unbelievably rich, deep, thoughtful stories about their time in board gaming, about their time as professionals. I got a real mix of people who are both hobbyists and industry professionals, and really breathtaking amounts of like investment. And, this survey took 40 minutes to complete. So it was
Wow.
people who felt very invested in sharing their perspectives. The stories alone were essentially the size of a dissertation. It was about 15,402 words. So again, the level of investment was unbelievable to me. And I felt like that told me something too, that there's so much pent up interest in sharing stories, sharing perspectives, and talking about how board gaming could be improved. And
Right.
so, from a top line perspective, and again, just the diversity of the sample that I got was really hard as well. So I can go further into the online survey results. I realize I've been talking for a bit here, but do you want me
So
to just yeah.
uh, I am. It's fascinating to me to think about the fact that I know so many women who work in board games and who are part of the creative process, and everything that you're talking about also for me prompts the question of how much uncredited investment and involvement and labor is there. How many times did somebody do a significant chunk of the design or the development or the whatever, and then by the time it gets printed and published and is in stores and on BGG, she's just been erased, or they've just been smoothed over because they were just helping. One of the most heartbreaking moments I've had is at Geekway to the West. I had a mom who is I don't even I watched her play a half dozen games, and she was the fastest, most succinct game developer I've ever seen in action, because she's like, "Oh, if we had just gotten a chance to play this before it was published, I would have tweaked the math this way, and it would have changed the play experience just this much and made it that much better." And I watched her just in awe as her brain internalized what was happening. And when I said to her, "Well, why don't you actually, like, can I introduce you to some publishers who could really use what you do?" And she says, "Oh, I just do this for fun. I think about this as a hobby. I'm just a mom." And I shattered, because this is somebody who all of the representation and all of the public facing, how board games thinks about itself, has told her that it's not a realm for her. She's not welcome. She's other. And we lost this giant brain where I was just like, "No, come work for me." And she's like, "No, no, like, I'm just here for my kids." And I was like, "Wow, we have shut the door so that this person just can't even imagine being part of the pool."
100%. And that specific story you shared was played out so many times in the stories that I heard during this research, and it breaks my heart. In fact, this is such a known phenomena that there's actually a term for it in the sciences called the Matilda effect,
Oh,
where
tell me more.
women where women's work is taken, appropriated, recast as men's work. And I see that I worked in tech, I worked in software development with hardware companies in life sciences, and I saw that play out professionally hundreds of times. Where and it's a socialized conditioning that we've got, and the story that you just shared really resonates with me because I also did a set of qualitative interviews with people in the profession to kind of go deeper on some of these perspectives. And one of the qualitative perspectives that was so heartbreaking and very similar to what you just shared was a woman who's an incredibly accomplished woman who is a board game designer, but couldn't bring herself to say she was. And when she finally said, "I am a board game designer," in a professional context, at the urging of her male colleague, she burst into tears because she felt like this is not something that is for me.
Right.
And I think that dynamic, is there's so many stories. I actually had a huge tangent in my dissertation, which I think I'm gonna spin into an article exactly, Avonelle, as you're saying, where women felt like they were marginalized in the work of board games and felt like, well, and sometimes it's also a defensive strategy. One of the other dynamics that I saw play out is a lot of people sharing that they don't want to be too visible. They don't want to engage online with board gaming topics for fear of harassment, trolling, and really toxic commentary. So a lot of those things shape us as women, as BIPOC individuals in this industry, in this cultural practice, to know that, maybe our appearance and our assertion and our, asserting ourselves and talking about ourselves will put us in a transgressive space. We're wading into a place that's not really ours, and we should just marginalize ourselves. And so we
Right.
do that to ourselves, and it is done to us in these spaces for sure. Yeah, it's absolutely right.
Um, I think it's fascinating, and I'm a little validated with the fact that you were looking at urban centers. I had a game publisher ask me, well, what should my goals be? In a conversation about representation and diversity. And this was after a conversation where I had flipped through the face art for a game and realized that there was not a single person of color. And I flipped, right? I'm like, this is not 1950. There's no excuse for this. We've been having this conversation for a long time. And what I blurted out was make your demographics match Indianapolis. Indianapolis hosts Gen Con, which is the biggest analog gaming convention in the country. If you're going to pick any random place and you are going to be like, let me just base my goal on this. And so, what I've been really encouraging publishers to think about is try to get the demographics on your box art, on your design team, all the way from copy editing to rules development to your core design team to match Indianapolis. Because if you can do that, imagine the doors that open up, and imagine the huge breadth of just social capital that these people can share and bring into the industry.
100%. And it's actually, I'm kicking myself as you say that because I did do a specific slide about Indianapolis, whose demographic mix, I believe, approaches almost 40% BIPOC and person of color. And so, you've got a lot of people use these discourses about, and this comes up a lot with my research that, well, a lot of gaming conventions, they're in the Midwest. And of course, that's coded
For their
as
very
well,
white.
that's the white heartland of the US. And again, just the basic level of audience research, demographic mapping, this is all available to us. This is the kind of work I would do when I used to be billing out at outrageous hourly sums for large multinationals in the organizations that I worked. Doing a basic level of demographic investigation into your target markets is the first place to start. And exactly right, Evanel. You're bringing people into and that's, I think, the big takeaway for me is you have to hire for diversity. You have to hire for diversity. You have to bring in a mix of people that have different perspectives, life experiences, because your end product will be the richer for it. And we actually tested that theory a little bit. Dr. Jones, Shelley Jones, one of the editors of Analog Game Studies, and we did a little bit of a test of that theory when we did a rule books investigation where we said, okay, is a rule book more likely to be more gender inclusive if the team is a little bit more diverse? And with the very small, it was a small scale study. With those small scale study findings, we did find that the more diverse the team was, the better the output was toward a more inclusive goal. And I think, like, the one thing that I'm sort of sounding the klaxon bell for publishers is you're not really, if you're not including diversity and representation and positive representation in your games, you are missing a huge opportunity right now, and you are not future proofing your business in the future. You are not getting ready for the market shifts and changes you need to navigate to survive. And I think that that's a big, big takeaway because, one of the things that I found in the qualitative research with the in this sample, actually, I was really heartened. people are avid board gamers. So I recruited for, do you love board games? And are you a woman, non-binary, LGBTQ plus, BIPOC person who loves board games? And what I got from the research is that a tremendous amount of gender diversity. Overwhelmingly, the people who responded to the survey were women. And what's super fascinating too, just as an aside, is everyone who responded to my survey had a board game geek profile, almost to a person.
Wow.
Yeah, and one of the things that I got, as feedback was, well, you didn't locate a sample of real gamers in your research, because I didn't have enough white straight men in the sample, and that's exactly, Avanel, what you're speaking to here, which is that notion of, okay, well, real board, they're maybe from the Midwest. Again, that's coded. The social imaginary around a board gamer is very skewed, very white and very male, and
I
maybe.
would say that around all gaming, I was at a LARP symposium many years ago when a person of color said, well, the first time someone suggested to me that I go LARP, I said, oh no, that's a white person thing. Right.
Yeah,
And so I think all gaming, all play is, I would say, very coded white and very presumed to be a white space.
absolutely right. And there's a really, really interesting set of challenges in our social imaginary. How we imagine an audience can actually distort the way, and this is something I used to talk to companies all the time about. Very often, companies will design everything, anything. Think of a product, any endeavor, and they will imagine an audience in their heads that often looks a lot like them. So in tech, it does tend to skew overwhelmingly white, middle class, middle to upper class male, and so a lot of products that are created in tech are made for the audience of themselves, right?
Right.
And that really harm a business. And I actually go through in other research pieces that I'm pulling together, examples in tech where that kind of thinking actually upended, and these companies that thought that way no longer exist, literally. And the companies that thought in a different way flourished and became leaders in the sector. And I think that,
It's
yeah, go ahead.
there's an interesting thing there where there's as a woman who's worked in tech a fair amount of my life, and as somebody who's worked in and adjacent to analog gaming for my entire adult life, it's interesting because as you're talking, what's playing in my head is this reel of all the women who have said to me, "It didn't used to be like this." Right? There used to be more women programmers. There used to be women jumping in. I didn't think anything of being in the RPGA as a woman in the 80s, and now it's a big deal. And people are like, wow, you're here. And I wonder if we could actually apply the backlash sort of concept to this and look at what has happened and see that there has been pushback and we've been edged out of those spaces because the other, tangentially but related, at a WashingCon, I sat on a panel about women in gaming, and I kind of threw my I'm tired of women in gaming panels. Can we talk about the things we're doing, whatever? And one of the really fascinating things I learned out of that specific panel was that Hasbro, many of their designers, statistically, their designers are more female, more women than represented anywhere on BGG or Reddit. And they just fly under the radar because Hasbro doesn't credit their designers.
100%. That's a really interesting dynamic. Well, and I think that like that is a thing that is really stifling growth. So, theorist, game scholar theorist Jesper Jewell, Dr. Jesper Jewell, had a book that was really, really big in video gaming, and it speaks exactly to the dynamic you're describing, Avanel. Where it was called the casual revolution, and for people who are video game scholars, it's mandatory reading in game scholarship programs. And what he described is a casual revolution. And there's a trajectory that he plotted just exactly as you're describing, Avanel, in video games, where initially, and it's something actually Dr. Amanda Cote talks about as well, where she looked at, arcade culture, very early video gaming. And you start with, you look at the sort of, it's a chart I have in my mind of global casualness. And basically, Jesper Juhl says it always starts gaming, video gaming started with everyone's welcome. Okay. And everyone was like very, very excited about video games. You can see in even some really early video game marketing ads. It was fun for the whole family. There were women in the imagery. There were women playing games, and it was kind of like shotgun marketed to
Mm.
everybody, and everybody was interested in it. And then what Jesper Juhl talks about is it then plummets into hardcore valley, where it starts to become okay. Now this is ours. We love this, and you go into this sort of trough. It's like the Gartner trough of disillusionment, but in this case, hardcore valley, where you've got then a very protected, highly segmented, Call of Duty, get good culture. It's male, it's aggressively male, and you sit there in the doldrums of that time where the market actually like tightens up, gets heavily segmented by marketers, and they really doggedly focus on one demography. And then you start to edge back up, and we're now in a place with video games. That dynamic where you get the casual revolution, where the money behind video games recognize you gotta open up. And then suddenly now in video games, and I do a compare and contrast in the research, the average video gamer is a middle-aged woman, is a
Mhm.
woman, definitely. 50-50 split, men, women. Because now we've got a much more expansive definition of video gaming, digital gaming, and the average game target is a woman and tends toward, being sort of in her 30s, 40s, and even, I'm a little older, it tends to be in that sort of epicenter. That's the gaming market right now, if you look at it in aggregate. And so board games are now still mired, certainly hobby board gaming, in the hardcore valley. And that is a very dangerous place for publishers and large companies to exist in, because that particular hardcore valley, that marketing splice, not only is it small from a demographic perspective, but it's super saturated. And I talked the other day to a contact about the idea that you've actually got genres now in board games, and I'm watching this dynamic with great interest, where it's couples often doing a cull or talking about getting rid of their board games or storage problems. And there's a lot of memes about it. Certainly an example, my partner and I, of couples that have so many board games, we don't know what to do. And so you're super saturating a very small demographic segment. And that's not a sustainable place to be. You're in that
Right.
hardcore valley and you're stuck.
Well, and that to me is such a wasted opportunity. If we look at the mainstream pickup of Comic Cons in the last
Yes.
10 years,
Yep.
being a nerd, playing games, doing geeky things, and thinking of yourself as smart and engaging in activities that feel nerdy, I have hit the mainstream. And
Yes.
so continuing to limit themselves to, I spend a lot of time talking about the idea that the prestige identity of being
Yep.
a hobby board gamer and being a hobby board game publisher is actually something that's very toxic to market growth, because if you're designing for only people who look and think like you and you're publishing only for people who look and think like you, how do we sustain things as people age out, as people
Yes.
I run gaming conventions. I rely on a constant influx of enthusiastic underclassmen.
Yes.
They age out, they get jobs, they have babies, they join PhD programs, they have to take care of elder parents. And so I'm acutely aware of the fact that if you're not constantly bringing in fresh blood, when someone gets tired of board gaming, someone has a career change, you lose that audience. And it makes no sense that from inside the industry, it feels like we have saturated and stagnated when nerd things are exploding all over the internet and all over
Exactly.
mainstream.
Exactly. And, during that time in the, hardcore valley doldrums, you've got a really the dynamic there is very, very toxic to growth. And I think that, the one thing that I consistently say, to anyone who will listen to me, is particularly game publishers, because my goal with this is I know I can't necessarily change hearts and minds with people who are really dug into a particular kind of identity. It's an ideology. It's it's like a political ideology. And I know I can't necessarily convince, some of the people who are really, really mired in that hardcore valley of gatekeeping, exclusionary, you're right, like prestige gaming. And, just as an aside, one of the things that someone said in response to my research, which I really appreciated, was they said, it makes you think about Kickstarter and these miniature heavy Kickstarters where, 10,000 units is considered spectacular.
Right.
And, that's not real growth. And I think that one of the things that, from a dynamic perspective, and again, speaking just strictly anecdotally, again, with that sort of subgenre of cults and where do we put stuff, and I don't know where to, we're seeing that really explode. How many more large box, miniature heavy games can any collection kind of take in? And you're starting to see some cracks in that prestige model of gaming when you've got a market. They're trained doggedly on a white middle class, possibly suburban, I mean, again, who has the room, kind of buyer who is super saturated. There's nowhere to go from there. And you're right, they'll age out, they'll move on, and you're not bringing in new blood because of the toxic dynamics of exclusionary gatekeeping, snobbery, the prestige of it. Are you really a game? Have you played Twilight Imperium? By the way, I have. And the core here is that there's got to be some room to grow. And I think one of the really really interesting things that I found, and this is interesting from a correlation perspective, just again thinking about ideology, is a lot of the people who respond to my survey were highly educated people who had completed at least some form of post-secondary. And what's super fascinating, you said PhDs. I also had a little hypothesis going in that a lot of gamers, there's a significant correlation between, instructors and people in academia and higher ed. Again, just because I meet a lot of people who are avid board gamers here in Toronto, and what I found really interesting is that, the above population average, the education level of a lot of the respondents to my board game survey were very heavily educated, and that correlates to a certain worldview. The more educated you are, the more likely you will be to be more conscious of these issues. So again, board game publishers, even with this sort of dogged trained focus on a particular segment, are really missing the boat from both a demographic perspective and also from their audience's perspective. The average person I found this population statistic, 6.9% of the people who responded to my survey had PhDs. Only 4.5% of the US population has them, and 0.88% in Canada. So way above population averages. And it's so interesting to me that, this sort of basic level, this is a small scale study, but a more concerted effort to get a sort of census of board gaming demography needs to happen. Particularly at that, kind of corporate level to say, okay, who's our audience really, or where can we go? Because I think we're also seeing a really interesting dynamic happening in the market where the assumption is too that white men tend to have maybe more leisure time. And I'm actually working on another article that looks at that dynamic of leisure time, who has it, who doesn't. And there's some really, really interesting research there, disposable income, leisure, and it's all correlated to a larger sort of systemic challenge with, women tend to have a little less leisure time than men, just on average. There's lots of really rigorous empirical studies. But women also tend to be a little more in the driver's seat when it comes to how they want to spend their leisure and how much they enjoy their leisure. I'm just looking at a research study that I'm reading right now. So we may have less of it, but we curate very carefully. And I
Right.
think that that's another dynamic. I heard tons during this research that a lot of women who engage with board gaming tend to do so in a very, very careful and curated way. A lot of the dynamics in the research and the big findings that I found are alarm bells to the board game industry, because a lot of people shared with me that, I avoid public board gaming events because I don't perceive them as particularly welcoming. I'm not impressed with some of the behavior. And so all of these factors are like sort of death of a thousand cuts, limiting the
Right.
growth of the sector and this cultural practice, which I think everyone should have access.
Well, and Thinking about that and thinking about all the ways that I've seen people excluded from board gaming spaces rather than invited in, um, one of the ones that comes to mind, and you kind of skirted around it, is that whole response that we sometimes get of, well, that's a terrible game, or that's not a real game. And I swear, if I could strike one thing from the overall lexicon of, just one sentence that could never be uttered again, well, that's just a bad game. Because part of one of the most interesting things that I have picked up in my time working with researchers now, through my role at Carnegie Mellon and interacting with researchers at other institutions, is that there is a cultural baseline that starts with Monopoly and Sorry and Life, which are the three that get mentioned the most often when I talk to people on the street about board games, and then builds from there. And hobby game designers and publishers and consumers tend to turn their nose up at it and be like, well, there's so much better. Okay, great. Let's build a catalog of literacy, and let's talk about the fact that playing Pinochle with grandma or playing Hearts with your uncle is game literacy and is gaming and makes you a gamer. And here are things that are adjacent to what you already know and what you're already literate in. You like roll and moves? Let's look at Run for Your Life Candyman from Smirk and Dagger. And then let's use that to boost you up into another game that maybe now feels more familiar. And it's interesting to me that the science is bearing out those things that have been kind of anecdotal and sort of colloquial knowledge in the industry for years, that people being like, well, Killer Bunnies is a terrible game. Killer Bunnies is a gateway game that I can put on a table and get a room of folks excited about being ridiculous. Or Munchkin, right? Munchkin is hugely
100%.
successful because it
Absolutely.
it welcomes everybody in. It doesn't take itself too seriously. And so hearing that the science supports these conversations that have been happening sort of off to the side, and that in some ways we try not to attract too much attention with those conversations because people get angry about being challenged.
Yes. 100%. And that's a great example. All of these discourses, everything you're describing here is a great example of that trajectory that Jesper Jewell talked about, where when you're mired in that, and you can see the plummet, he basically, it's like the hardcore valley, you're stuck there. And there's a discourse around, well, if it's not incredibly brain-breakingly Demon Souls level hard, then it's not a real game. It's not, Bloodborne.
Playing on
You
easy
need
mode is
and that those
ridiculous.
discourses, that approach. Yep, exactly. And what that does is it keeps your hobby very, very small. And, the toxicity in the hobby, even around some of those discourses, what about games for neurodivergent folks? What about games for people who, one of the really interesting things that came out of the qualitative interviews was this idea that, I was literally speaking to in one instance an individual who is extremely educated, extremely, extremely brilliant, has 2 kids. And I know, having the life of a single mom, I love, brain burny games. I tend to be, fairly intellectual. I read a book a week, or at least I did until I started this dissertation. I was reading more now. Um, and the thing that's interesting about it is this individual who's brilliant said, "I'm tired. I am making meals for my whole family. I'm cleaning the house. There's the second shift that happens to a lot of women. I'm exhausted. I am running around, driving everyone everywhere, probably even more so now with the pandemic, and I'm tired. I It's not that I can't play an incredibly brain burny difficult game, but I can't integrate it into being interrupted every 5 minutes by my kids. So you have to give me something that I can integrate into my busy life, and that's that, casual revolution that Jesper Jewell talked about, where it's integrated, where games have changed. You can have a pick up and play game, and we all need it now because our access to leisure, every single one of us, is eroding every single day. And so we need that integration. We cannot do I used to sit for, entire weekends and play, Horizon Zero Dawn or Fallout. And I don't really have that time anymore. And so we
Right.
have to change the way we integrate gaming. And so that changes the way publishers think about games. You've got games like Elizabeth Hargrave's Tussie Mussy, where you can play it in like 5, 7 minutes. You can play it standing up.
Yep.
That's the kind of game, that's the kind of thinking around games that needs to happen because that's what our lives require. And everyone, I believe, fundamentally, just as you're saying, should become games literate. And that is a key dynamic that you just described. So important because everyone needs this literacy because it's being integrated more and more into games and curriculum, game based learning. And
Yep.
if you do not make a young girl, a BIPOC individual, going through school, games literate, they're gonna miss out on a lot. Not only fun, not only access to leisure, not only access to identity creation that happens in RPGs, but they're also going to lose out on in school, professionally, and gatekeeping, this toxicity, this behavior, this hardcore valley mindset keeps people away and ruins businesses, frankly.
So, two thoughts. One, I have a housemate who taught high school math, and her students were mostly students that struggled academically.
Yeah.
And when she started teaching probability, they didn't know the what the makeup of a deck of cards was.
Yes.
And so teaching probability to these kids, she had to start with there's four suits, ace through um God, I just blanked. Through 10 face
Yeah.
cards. She had to start at that level, which means that there's that culturally these kids are being excluded from this entire base of media. Um, and to me, that plays to the if we don't make gaming accessible to everybody, and it is gate kept, that is a huge problem for market growth and for including people. And the other thing is, I'm really curious talking about that valley, that hardcore valley.
Yeah.
The thing that keeps coming to mind is the meme that went around a while ago about Lego marketing and how in the 70s it included both genders and included people of color. And
Yes.
then it became very white and very male. And in the last, 5 or 7 years, they're doing so much more. They did the women scientist set, they are doing the bonsai set, and things that are more traditionally femme coded. Um, and I'm really fascinated in 5, 7, 10 years to be able to look at their data, their sales data, and because I suspect it's going to track with that casual revolution, and we're going to come up out of
Absolutely.
that valley,
Yep.
and they will have opened up their audience to a whole new market.
And more and more corporations are recognizing this. Like there's a reason. I have another colleague who's studying, just the dynamics of corporations. There's a really good reason why corporations are making bets that favor, that want diversity, that are really willing to, from a political perspective, large multinationals are really willing to put their, kind of money where their mouth is and make sure that diversity is part of their organizations. They're doing this for two reasons, actually. One is they need access to labor, and people don't want to work at organizations where diversity is not privileged. They want to feel like they're doing good by having an organization that embraces diversity. But also from a market perspective, it just makes sense. Any decision that limits a particular practice, and as you say, like literacy is a core part of that. Any sector that does that is not going to survive because they cannot grow. One of the things that we used a lot in tech, and it's a really old trope, but it's the Jeffrey Moore crossing the chasm beachhead strategy, where initially you start with your a target base, and then once you've established that war metaphor beachhead, you have to radiate out. You have to start politicking, and just like you're saying with Lego, that's a beautiful example because Lego does a lot of ambassadorial, outreach, roots campaigning. They do a lot of work from a corporate social responsibility perspective to show, to demonstrate that they care about these things, so they bring more people in. They signal to the market, "We care about these things." They make these products available, and maybe the products are not necessarily, you have to sit I used to sit for, 20 hours, sometimes at a time to build a, castle with a drawbridge. I did this and felt like I broke my back. Maybe you have a little simpler sets that can be easily integrated into one's life that is busy, that is
Yeah.
incredibly filled with, family responsibilities. and it has different theming to expand your base. And they'll also work with, various organizations from a consultative and grassroots perspective to create literacy, to create an appetite for their market, because why would you want to do otherwise?
Right.
It doesn't make sense from a business perspective.
One of the first people that really challenged me to think about how gaming intersects with all sorts of intersectional theory and all sorts of influences like time and family care and all this is Avery Alder, the creator of Monster Hearts. And we
Right.
had a conversation, and Avery's done a lot of work about decolonizing gaming. And the day that Avery was like, look, if I can sit down and play something beginning to end in 2 hours, that fits into a busy week where everybody's worked and we've got kids and we have to get everybody fed. But if I need 4 or 6 hours, it's going to take me that much longer to find time and space and get people together. For me, that just solidified something in me where I said, oh, it's not that I'm a bad gamer and it's not that I'm not a gamer. It's that I have to really carefully select my form factor.
Yes.
And I don't have the attention span, I don't have the patience, I don't have the resources to regularly play a 4 or 6 or 8 hour thing. But as an example, I'm playing Zelda Breath of the Wild finally on my Switch, and the fact that I can do one objective, I can look off in the distance and find a tower, I can go unlock
Exactly.
that tower, pause, and come back to it 2 days later, is that perfect example of making it accessible to people who don't have the ability to prioritize gaming as their core identity.
That is 100%, and video game companies have recognized that, and they're doing that with intention. They're doing that through research. That what you just described is exactly what I'm hopeful the board game industry will start to recognize. It has worked as a model for video gaming. That this is a trajectory that they have taken themselves out of Hardcore Valley and done exactly what you're describing, which is that
Mm.
integration where you can do that simple quest. One of the interesting dynamics for all of us right now is, some stats that I found in Canada. Less than 50% of the Canadian workforce for women, among women, have a full-time year-round job. Precarity is a reality. So I'm
Yep.
an example of a precarious worker. And if I am not turning almost every hour of my waking life into some kind of revenue, I cannot support myself. And so, as a precarious worker, as so many of us are who are often on contract, you need to really carefully budget your time. And what's interesting, I actually teach a class today with project management students, and one of the things where I'm analyzing today actually is just how little leisure time we all have every day. One example is a meme that I'm going to be showing is like, think about it for your own day. Do you have a half an hour where you have nothing to do? That's a really interesting question, and the sort of average for women is about a half an hour less than men, and every single day. And I think that that's something you have to really think about your time budget. That is a huge factor. But people are willing to make time for video games because, Avanel, exactly as you described, it can integrate. You want that little moment where you can do something that is not, you know, cleaning up or, doing work. You have that little moment and you can do it within that half an hour period of the leisure you've got that day, and then you can put it down and come back to it. And, Twilight Imperium, when I played it, was 10 hours, and it
Right.
was a very rare moment in my life that it was really tough to pull together a group that could do that. And that group was 100%, older white males and me.
Right.
So, I think that's a really, really that's a huge dynamic, and publishers are need to start thinking from the ground up about the mechanics you're using, the duration, the player count. How does this integrate into somebody's life? And that kind of thinking needs to happen fast because these publishers won't survive in the long term if they don't change their thinking.
Absolutely. I I wonder if what we're going to see is a market contraction where publishers either end up significantly focused on Kickstarter, where they have their core audience that is excited by the big box of plastic, which are games that have their place
Yep,
and
I
have
love
a
them too.
valid, excited, enthused audience, but it is a very specific sort of audience. Um, and it would be a shame if we lost the innovation and the inventiveness of the mid-tier publishers who are doing interesting, inclusive, accessible things intermittently and without focus and without having a overall niche community that looks at it and says, we're going to support you in doing these things. We're going to support you. And so I hope that 5 years from now, you and I aren't talking and we've got a striation where that middle realm where that innovation is so necessary in order to reach outward just disappears. And that is my concern for the next 5 years is let's get people moving quickly enough that they start engaging those new audiences.
100%, and it absolutely has to happen. And, I share stories online, Twitter about, just examples of tech, real cautionary tales in tech, where they did not segment, they did not think about other audiences. I had one client who absolutely refused for reasons of, I believe, snobbery, that this is our base and we're not going to deviate from our base. The company no longer exists. And the other client that I had that really did exactly as you're saying, Avanel, really outreached, had different market segments, different audience, divisions, did lots of giveaways, did lots of literacy programs, went out and had people we called evangelists who would tour the country talking about the wonders of personal computing. This is way back in tech. And really invested in bringing other people. They used to say, we don't care about our saturated base. We only care about expanding the people who do computing. And
Yep.
that company is a market dominator now. So there's tons of parallels here. I see a lot of parallels between like really early tech and what's happening in gaming spaces. And we got to get out of the hardcore valley.
That's so fascinating because I spend a lot of time drawing comparisons between game retail and book retail in the early aughts.
Yeah,
And there are a lot of similarities where when Amazon and Barnes Noble really became market forces, the sky is falling, everything's going to change, this is awful, they're ruining our market. And a lot of how the industry is responding to Kickstarter.
right.
And, right, self publishing decolonizes, but then also creates your hardcore consumers that are like, I'm only going to do this one way.
That's right.
And the additional dimension of comparing it to early tech is really fascinating.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of parallels there, and a really, really, again, a cocktail. My big sort of overarching thesis is, I think that the market, I think board gaming is being stifled, delimited by a lot of these dynamics of sort of toxicity around who belongs and who can game and who is a quote unquote real gamer. And that really is causing huge market problems for board gaming in general.
How
And
fabulous would it be if we could just hand out clickers to everybody that isn't a straight white male, and every time someone opens their mouth to do that, we just collectively click at them until we just abolish that behavior?
Yeah, no, I think it's an incredibly, again, from strictly and I'm speaking to publishers and companies and the funders of these companies, that dynamic that's playing out in your space is hurting you so profoundly, and you've got to make every possible effort to curate your communities and to stop this toxicity because it's hurting your bottom line. And I guess, I mean, I learned over to money. And I think that's my big, we're shouting from the rooftops message that you gotta fix this because it's not going to be good for the long run, for sure.
Right. All right, Tanya, thank you so much for joining me. Is
Mm.
there anything you would like to add as a wrap up?
Yeah, no, just if anyone is interested in getting in contact with me, I'm available on Twitter at Pobuda, Pobuda, Tanya, Tanya. And I'm so happy to engage people. I love talking about this, debating it. Really anxious to share my research with everybody. I'm really pleased to say that my dissertation is going to committee, even hopefully tomorrow, and we'll have more.
Congratulations.
Thanks. Thanks so
I
much, and thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. This has been just so validating as a practitioner in the board game industry. I am excited that there's science now to point to and be like, here, you can actually look at numbers. So
So many
thank you for the work you're doing, and thank you for being a lightning rod. We see you.
Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it, and all your hard work.
Thanks.